Imagine a world where finding information felt like searching for a book inside a library that had no catalog, no shelves, and no librarian. The internet in the early 1990s looked exactly like that. Websites were appearing rapidly, but there was no reliable way to know which ones mattered, which ones were accurate, or which ones were simply noise. People forget this today, but the internet did not always feel powerful. It felt chaotic. You could spend hours clicking links and still walk away with nothing useful. Knowledge existed, but it was scattered, unorganized, and often invisible. Here is the question most people never ask. Who decided how the world's information should be organized? That decision did not come from a government committee, a global institution, or a technology giant. It began quietly inside a university campus with two students who were not trying to build a company at all. They were trying to solve a research problem. Larry Page arrived at Stanford University in the mid-1990s with an unusual obsession. He wasn't interested in websites themselves. He was interested in the relationships between them. To him, the web looked less like a collection of pages and more like a network of connections, almost like academic papers citing one another. Sergey Brin, another Stanford student, came from a background deeply rooted in mathematics and data analysis. Where Larry was conceptual and abstract, Sergey was analytical and experimental. Their personalities often clashed, but that tension became their advantage. Together, they began asking a simple but revolutionary question. What if the importance of a web page could be measured by how many other pages pointed to it? At the time, search engines already existed, but they ranked results mostly by keyword repetition. The more a word appeared on a page, the higher it ranked. This system was easy to manipulate and often produced useless results. Larry and Sergey approached the problem differently. They believed that links were votes. If many pages linked to one page, that page probably mattered, and if important pages linked to it, it mattered even more. This idea became the foundation of an algorithm that would later be known as PageRank. At first, this project had no grand vision. It wasn't about power, profit, or influence. It was about order, about reducing chaos, about making sense of something that was growing faster than any human system could manage. Their early search engine didn't even have a proper name. It was tested quietly within Stanford's network, but something strange began to happen. People who used it noticed a difference immediately. Results felt cleaner, faster, more accurate. Word spread not through marketing, but through experience. And that's the first critical moment in Google's history that most people overlook. Google did not convince people to trust it. People discovered that it worked. As usage increased, so did the pressure. Their servers were overloaded. Stanford's infrastructure wasn't built to support what was happening. What started as a research project was becoming a public utility, whether they intended it or not. This forced a choice. Either shut it down or take it outside the university. They chose the second option. In 1998, Google was officially incorporated, not in a massive office, not with a large team, but inside a garage, funded by a small investment from Andy Bechtolsheim, one of the founders of Sun Microsystems. The check was written before the company even existed on paper. Here's the part that matters historically. Google did not begin as a product company. It began as an infrastructure idea. From the start, the goal wasn't to create content, but to organize it, not to speak, but to listen, not to publish knowledge, but to index it. This philosophy would shape every decision that followed. Instead of filling the homepage with ads or graphics, Google did the opposite. A clean white screen, a logo, a search box, nothing else. This design choice was not just aesthetic, it was ideological. Google was saying something without words. Information should be accessed, not distracted from. As more users arrived, Google faced another challenge that could have ended everything. How do you make money from a tool that is designed to get out of the way? Most companies at the time chased banners, pop-ups, and flashy promotions. Google resisted, they waited, and that waiting changed the future of the internet. Rather than selling attention, Google decided to sell relevance. Ads would appear only when they matched what the user was searching for, and even then, they would be separated visually from organic results. This decision created trust. Users didn't feel tricked. Advertisers didn't feel ignored. It was subtle but powerful. By the early 2000s, Google was no longer just a search engine. It was becoming a gatekeeper, not by force but by function. If something could not be found on Google, for most people, it effectively did not exist. This is where Google's story stops being a startup story and starts becoming a historical one. Because once you control how information is found, you indirectly shape what people learn, what they believe, and what they ignore. And Google was only getting started. If this story feels larger than just a company, that's because it is. What began as a student project was slowly turning into one of the most influential systems in modern human history. And in the next part, the question will no longer be how Google was built, but how it quietly expanded into almost every corner of the digital world without most people noticing. As Google's search engine spread across the world, something subtle but important began to change. People were no longer browsing the internet the way they once did. They weren't wandering from site to site out of curiosity. They were asking questions, and Google was answering them. That shift mattered more than most people realized at the time. Before Google, the internet rewarded those who shouted the loudest. After Google, it rewarded those who were referenced, linked, and trusted. This quiet change reshaped how websites were built, how information was written, and how knowledge itself was structured online. By the early 2000s, Google had become the default doorway to the internet. For millions of users, the web no longer began with a homepage or a portal. It began with a blank box and a blinking cursor. Here's a question worth pausing on. What happens when one company becomes the starting point for human curiosity? Google itself seemed cautious of this power. Inside the company, a phrase circulated repeatedly, "Don't be evil." It wasn't a slogan meant for advertising. It was an internal reminder, an acknowledgement that organizing information came with responsibility. At the same time, Google was expanding in ways most users barely noticed. In 2001, Eric Schmidt joined as CEO, bringing structure and experience to a company that had grown faster than its founders expected. Larry Page and Sergey Brin remained deeply involved, but Schmidt helped transform Google from a brilliant idea into a functioning institution. This balance between innovation and organization allowed Google to scale without losing its core identity. Then came a series of decisions that would quietly redefine the modern internet. Google Images launched, changing how visual information was discovered. Gmail arrived, offering more storage than competitors thought was necessary, subtly training users to keep their digital lives inside Google's ecosystem. Google Maps followed, turning geography into data, streets into searchable objects, and locations into coordinates that could be analyzed and optimized. None of these products felt aggressive, they felt useful, and that was the key. Google rarely forced itself into people's lives. It waited until people invited it in. But behind this simplicity, something complex was taking shape. Google was no longer just organizing web pages, it was organizing behavior. Search patterns revealed intent, emails revealed habits, maps revealed movement. Each product alone seemed harmless. Together, they created an unprecedented understanding of how people lived, thought, and decided. This wasn't surveillance in the traditional sense. It was voluntary participation. People offered their data in exchange for convenience, speed, and accuracy. And most believed it was a fair trade. Another turning point arrived in 2006 when Google acquired YouTube. At the time, YouTube was a fast-growing but unstable platform. Many companies saw it as risky. Google saw something else. They saw the future of information shifting from text to video. This acquisition transformed Google from a search engine into a media infrastructure. Knowledge was no longer just something you read. It was something you watched, heard, and experienced. From that moment on, Google wasn't simply helping people find information. It was hosting it. And with hosting came influence. Search rankings could shape visibility. Recommendations could shape attention. Algorithms could shape culture. Still, Google maintained its image as a neutral organizer. It didn't present opinions, it presented results. It didn't claim authority, it claimed efficiency. But neutrality at scale is complicated. As Google grew, governments, businesses, and institutions began to realize something important. If you wanted to be seen, you had to understand Google. Entire industries formed around search optimization. News outlets adjusted headlines. Companies rewrote content. Even political campaigns studied algorithms, not to control them, but to survive within them. Google never announced these changes. It never demanded compliance. It simply adjusted its systems, and the world adapted. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of Google's history. Power did not arrive through confrontation. It arrived through dependence. By the late 2000s, Google had become something unprecedented, a private company providing public infrastructure on a global scale. Search, email, maps, video, browsers, operating systems, each one reinforced the others. Leaving Google became inconvenient. Staying became effortless. And that raises a deeper historical question. When convenience becomes essential, and essential systems are owned privately, how does society adapt? Google didn't answer that question directly. Instead, it continued building. Android entered the market, not as a device, but as a platform. It allowed Google to extend its reach into pockets, cars, homes, and eventually entire cities. Again, the strategy was familiar. Offer tools for free, improve them constantly, and let usage create loyalty. From the outside, it looked like success. From the inside, it looked like inevitability. Google was no longer reacting to the world was reacting to Google. And yet, even as its influence expanded, the company insisted it was still doing the same thing it had always done, organizing the world's information and making it universally accessible and useful. The difference was scale. When two students tried to organize the web, it was a technical challenge. When a global platform organizes human knowledge, it becomes a historical force. And that is where the story becomes more complex, because influence invites scrutiny and growth invites consequences. In the next part, the focus will shift away from innovation and toward impact, how Google's rise began to change economies, governments, and the very idea of information control in the modern world. As Google's presence became unavoidable, something else started to happen beneath the surface. The company was no longer just shaping how information was found. It was quietly influencing how decisions were made. Think about it for a moment. When people look for medical advice, financial guidance, travel routes, or breaking news, they don't compare 10 sources anymore. They type a question and trust the first few results. That trust didn't come from authority given by law. It came from years of reliability. And trust, once established at scale, becomes power. Businesses began to notice that a small change in Google's algorithm could mean the difference between growth and collapse. A website that ranked first could build an empire. A website that disappeared from the first page could vanish almost overnight. This wasn't punishment. It was simply how attention flowed. Google never told companies how to behave, but everyone learned quickly that visibility depended on alignment with Google's systems. Content became cleaner, faster, and more structured. In many ways, this improved the internet. In other ways, it narrowed it. This is where the story becomes less about technology and more about society. As Google expanded globally, it encountered different legal systems, cultural expectations, and political realities. Some countries welcomed Google as a tool for development and education. Others saw it as a threat to control. Google faced a dilemma it could not code its way out of. Should information be universal everywhere, or should it adapt to local rules? Should search results reflect global standards or national boundaries? There was no perfect answer. In some regions, Google chose to limit its services. In others, it complied with regulations that conflicted with its original ideals. Each decision carried consequences, and each compromise reshaped what organizing the world's information truly meant. At the same time, Google's internal structure was evolving. In 2015, the company announced a major transformation. Google would become part of a larger entity called Alphabet. On paper, this looked like corporate restructuring. Historically, it was something more important. Alphabet allowed Google to separate its core services from its experimental ambitions. Search, ads, YouTube, and Android remained central, but alongside them emerged projects focused on health, artificial intelligence, transportation, and long-term scientific research. This signaled a shift in identity. Google was no longer just responding to how people used the internet. It was preparing for how people might live in the future. Self-driving technology, medical diagnostics, language translation, and machine learning were no longer side projects. They were central to Google's vision. Information was no longer only something to be retrieved, it was something to be predicted. This introduced a new question into Google's history. What happens when a company moves from organizing information to anticipating human behavior? The answer wasn't immediate. In fact, most users didn't notice the change at all. Services still worked, search still felt neutral, the interface remained simple. But underneath, systems were becoming more complex. Algorithms learned patterns, recommendations became personalized, results were no longer the same for everyone. For the first time, two people could ask the same question and receive different answers. That moment marks a quiet but significant turning point. Information was no longer just organized, it was tailored. Supporters saw this as progress. Personalized results saved time and improved relevance. Critics worried about isolation, echo chambers, and invisible influence. Google, as always, framed the change as utility, and for most users it was. Yet history teaches us that systems designed for efficiency often reshape values in unexpected ways. As Google continued to grow, scrutiny increased. Regulators asked questions about competition. Journalists examined data practices. Academics debated the long-term effects of algorithmic mediation. Google responded with transparency reports, policy updates, and public dialogue. But the underlying reality remained unchanged. The company had become too embedded to simply be removed. This is one of the defining characteristics of modern power. It doesn't announce itself, it integrates. Google didn't conquer territory, it connected it. It didn't command attention, it organized it. And that distinction matters. Because when power is invisible, it's rarely questioned until it becomes indispensable. Today, Google exists in a strange historical position. It is both a tool and an institution, both a service and a system. It shapes daily life while insisting it only reflects it. Whether that balance can last is still an open question. What is clear is this: Google's story is no longer just about innovation. It is about responsibility, influence, and the future of how humans interact with knowledge itself. And in the final part of this story, everything comes together: the ideals, the compromises, and the legacy of a company that quietly became one of the most important forces of the modern age. What makes Google's story different from most companies in history is not just how fast it grew, but how quietly it became essential. There was no single moment when the world voted to hand over its curiosity, its directions, its emails, and its questions. It happened gradually, through habit. By the time people began asking whether Google had too much influence, most of them could no longer imagine daily life without it. This is where history becomes uncomfortable, because dependence and convenience often arrive together. Google did not replace governments, schools, or libraries. It redefined how people approached them. Students no longer began research with bookshelves. Journalists no longer started investigations without search. Travelers trusted maps they could not see being built. Even memory itself began to shift outward from the human mind to digital storage. Why remember facts when you can retrieve them instantly? That simple question represents one of the deepest cultural changes of the information age. As Google matured, it faced challenges that no startup handbook could prepare it for. Antitrust investigations, privacy debates, and public skepticism followed its success. Critics argued that dominance, even when earned, required limits. Supporters argued that breaking Google apart could damage the very systems people relied on. Google stood in the middle of this tension, insisting it was still doing what it had always done, improving access to information. And yet, history shows that scale changes intention. A tool used by millions behaves differently when used by billions. Small design choices become global norms. Minor updates ripple across economies. An algorithm tweak can affect livelihoods, opinions, and cultural visibility. This doesn't mean Google became malicious. It means Google became consequential. Inside the company, engineers still focused on speed, accuracy, and efficiency. But outside, society began asking deeper questions. Who decides what is relevant? Who defines quality? Who is accountable when automated systems shape outcomes? These questions do not have simple answers, and Google has never claimed to fully resolve them. Instead, it adapted, policies evolved, transparency increased, controls were added. At the same time, innovation continued. Artificial intelligence, language models, and predictive systems pushed Google further from its origins as a simple search engine. The company that once indexed the web was now helping interpret it. This is where Google's history intersects with the future. Information is no longer static. It is generated constantly, filtered automatically, and delivered instantly. In that environment, the role of an organizer becomes more powerful than the role of a creator. Google does not tell people what to think, but it influences what people encounter before they think. That distinction is subtle but critical. Looking back, it becomes clear that Google's rise was not inevitable because of money, marketing, or force. It was inevitable because it solved a real human problem at exactly the right moment. It brought order to chaos. It reduced friction. It respected time. And in doing so, it reshaped expectations forever. The most important legacy of Google may not be a product, a platform, or a profit figure. It may be the assumption it created, that knowledge should be searchable, immediate, and accessible to anyone, anywhere. That idea alone has changed education, journalism, commerce, and culture. Whether the next era will continue this path, challenge it, or replace it entirely remains unknown. But one thing is certain from a historical perspective. The moment humanity learned to ask the internet questions, the world changed. And the company that made those questions feel effortless did not just build a business. It built an interface between human curiosity and the sum of recorded knowledge. That is why Google's history is not finished. It is still being written every time someone types a question and waits for an answer. Even now, long after Google stopped feeling new, its influence keeps unfolding in ways that are easy to miss. Every generation has a technology that quietly rewires how people think. For some, it was the printing press. For others, radio or television. For this era, it is search. And search, more than anything else, trained people to expect answers instantly. That expectation didn't stay online. It moved into classrooms, workplaces, and everyday conversations. Waiting began to feel inefficient. Not knowing began to feel temporary. Curiosity no longer ended with uncertainty, it ended with a query. This is where Google's historical impact goes beyond economics or technology. It changed the psychology of knowledge. People stopped asking who knows the answer and started asking where the answer can be found. Authority shifted away from individuals and toward systems. Trust moved from voices to results. That shift is still unfolding. At the same time, Google's own role continues to evolve. It is no longer only reacting to human questions. Increasingly, it is anticipating them. Suggestions appear before searches are typed. Routes are adjusted before traffic is seen. Information is offered before it is requested. From a historical lens, this represents a profound transition. The organizer of information is becoming a guide through it. Some see this as progress, others see it as risk, but both sides agree on one thing: this level of influence has never existed before in human history. And yet, Google remains almost invisible in daily life. There are no grand speeches, no dramatic announcements, just a quiet presence in the background, working best when it goes unnoticed. That may be the most powerful position of all. Because when something becomes invisible, it becomes assumed. And when it becomes assumed, it becomes foundational. The story that began with two students trying to map the web has turned into a story about how humanity navigates knowledge itself, not through institutions or traditions, but through interfaces and algorithms. Whether future generations will see this as liberation or limitation is a question history has not answered yet. What history can say with certainty is this: the way humans seek information will never return to what it was before. And at the center of that irreversible change stands a company that didn't promise to change the world, only to help people find it. If you look closely, Google's greatest achievement was never technology alone. It was shaping a habit so natural that most people no longer notice it. The habit of asking. Even decades after two students first connected links and created an algorithm in a dorm room, the effects of that experiment are still being felt everywhere. Google is no longer simply a company, it is a framework for how knowledge is stored, accessed, and interpreted across the world. The influence of Google reaches far beyond the internet. It has shaped education by determining which resources students encounter first. It has shaped commerce by deciding which businesses are most visible. It has shaped communication, journalism, and even entertainment. Every click, every query, every search result contributes to a pattern that influences daily life in subtle but profound ways. History shows that when a system becomes foundational, it gains power not through force, but through dependence. Google never asked for obedience, it only provided utility, and humans responded. People came to rely on it so deeply that the boundaries between life before Google and life after are almost impossible to remember. The company that started as a research project transformed into a global infrastructure. Search became just one part of a vast ecosystem that includes maps, email, productivity tools, cloud computing, AI, and more. Each expansion made Google more embedded, more essential, and more capable of shaping behavior while remaining largely invisible. The story of Google is also a story of responsibility. Power without awareness is dangerous, and Google's influence demands accountability. Governments, regulators, and the public have all begun to recognize that shaping access to information is not neutral. It has consequences for society, culture, and democracy itself. Yet at its core, Google's mission remains consistent: to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. The company continues to innovate, anticipate needs, and expand the possibilities of how humans interact with knowledge. Its history is a testament to what can happen when a simple idea, linking pages to measure importance, meets the right combination of timing, talent, and opportunity. For historians and curious minds alike, Google is more than a tech company. It is a mirror of human ambition, intelligence, and desire for order in a chaotic world. It is a reminder that even the simplest ideas, when executed with precision and foresight, can transform civilization. And finally, as you reflect on the journey from a chaotic early internet to a world organized by algorithms and data, consider this: history is not just about wars, empires, or leaders. Sometimes, history is about ideas, and the quiet, powerful ones often shape the future more than any loud conquest ever could. The legacy of Google is still being written, and the most important chapter may be the one we are living right now. Every search, every click, every question asked is a part of that ongoing story. And in that sense, we are all participants in the history of Google, whether we realize it or not.